Before we move on from this frontline setting, though, I think, in the interest of fair and balance, I think it's really important for us to recognize the limitations of these regimens in terms of their tolerance. And they're different. The reality is we have, differences in not just the side effects, but really the mechanism of those side effects, from things like diarrhea and LFT abnormalities to, the chronicity of these side effects with TKIs versus with IO therapies, and how we manage it with steroids versus other supportive cares, and now beyond steroids. I mean, the world of immune modulatory, symptom management has gotten incredibly complex. It really requires multidisciplinary teams, as Raina mentioned early on. I don't know, Raina, do you want to talk to us a little bit about sort of your side effects, kind of take on sort of the IO-IO combination, the IO-TKI combinations, TKIs alone, how you size that up and what you're looking for, and then, when do you really pull the trigger on these multidisciplinary teams?
Yeah. So I think it's important to just understand the nature of the toxicity profiles that we see with a VEGF targeting agent or IO-VEGF therapy versus IO-IO. With VEGF targeted therapy, the toxicity tends to be dose dependent, it's predictable, it's chronic, it's sometimes on target and some off target, effects of therapy. And when we look at the IO, regimens, specifically the PD-L1 targeted therapies, they're not dose dependent and they're not necessarily predictable. With IPI, we do know that the toxicity can be dose dependent, but it also is not predictable. So it's hard to know who's going to get toxicity with IO-IO. We don't necessarily have a biomarker to say, barring somebody who has an existing autoimmune disease, we don't have a biomarker to say, you're going to get it, you're not going to get it. I have no idea who's going to be in the 1/3 category that I'm going to end up needing to give steroids to, or the small population of patients that end up getting infliximab or TNF-alpha inhibition. So I think the biggest thing is, one is communication to the patient around the toxicity. And, especially the IO tox, because of the somewhat unpredictable, onset. That being said, when we look at sort of the toxicity profile curves from, Checkmate 214, most of the severe grade 3-4 tox did seem to come on within the first 6 months or so of therapy. And then once the IPI kind of was removed or discontinued or stopped, and they remained on PD-L1 inhibition alone, the degree of severe toxicity did come down. Whereas when we look at like the IO-VEGF, there's that chronicity of tox that we continue to see just from the chronic ongoing, TKI. And I think the other, confounder with IO-VEGF is there's a lot of overlapping tox, particularly with the diarrhea and the hepatitis, that you're sort of, which one is it? So you don't want to just call everything immune mediated right away, because that has significant implications for re-challenging and steroids and tapering. And so, the beauty of axitinib, it's got a short half-life. You can quickly stop it. You can, try to tease out, okay, did the diarrhea get a little bit better? Did their LFTs get a little bit better? Okay, maybe it's the axitinib. Let me, ride this out. Maybe redose them at a lower dose or something like that. So, but it requires a lot more kind of nuance and a lot more checking to see what it is. Whereas with the IO-IO, unless somebody's got some concurrent ongoing, comorbidity or something, you can point it to the IO agent, the nivo-ipi. So, but I think the biggest thing is communication, and communication to the patient, and honestly, the communication to the nursing staff, because those are the people that are at the front lines. Like when a patient calls, like, I'm having a little bit of diarrhea. Well, how much is a little bit? Like, what's your baseline? So we have like huge education, sessions with our nursing team, our LVN team, the people that are at the front lines who, triage calls, triage symptoms, and we instruct the patient, anything that you're really not sure is, call us and we'll walk you through it. We'll triage for you. Don't do the triage yourself, So, but I think it's educating the entire care team, and when there is significant grade 3-4, I think the biggest issue is delaying the initiation of steroids, or kind of dragging your feet around it. I think, Where I've gotten burned has been where I've just been like, should I not? And you know, I think sort of if there's a high index of suspicion and the patient's not doing well, you know, start them on steroids. I think historically we used to do this full-fledged diagnostic workup to get a, you know, biopsy to prove that it's immune mediated, but I don't think necessarily we have to go through that. If the patient is sick and there's a high index of suspicion, just start. And if there's no improvement, add the infliximab, you know?
Yeah. No, I think that's really, I think that's great advice. And you know, I'm curious, you know, we're all at academic centers and we, you know, at academic centers have, you know, specialists in these, you know, subspecialists in these areas of, you know, GI or dermatology or cardiology or what have you that really help us when we get into these complicated cases and whatnot. How do you advise folks in the community? You know, Raj, you know, you're up there in Utah, and you have a lot of community docs that are relatively rural areas. How do you advise them on how to manage that, and you know when to send the patient into more of a tertiary center for help with this, or when to bring in their, you know, local specialists, you know, who, you know, can help them kind of recognize, okay, this is there's something more serious with this rash, or something more serious with this, you know, pulmonary situation. How do you advise folks there?
Yeah, so first of all, my experience is that my community colleagues are very smart clinicians who are able to manage patients with 100 different kind of cancers. So that's the first, you know, impression I have of my community oncology colleagues. So instead of, I would say, advice, I would say for patients with metastatic kidney cancer, I may have, you know, used EP-Nivo just recently, but many of my colleagues are using this for melanoma for many more years, right? But I think by far, VEGF TKI plus PD-1 axis inhibitor combos are more popular with the community practices as opposed to EP-Nivo, which is, I think, the preferred regimen, at least in our practice in academic institutions. And I think this has to do with the unpredictability of the colitis part with ipilimumab. I think that is single most important factor which drives the uptake of VEGF TKI plus PD-1 combos versus EP-Nivo in academic cancer centers. We have more, I think we have more support, supportive oncology clinics, triage lines, nurse practitioners, fellows. I think these are usually not available in community practices, especially in, as you said, Dan, Intermountain West. Many practitioners are all by themselves in 300 miles around. So I think, you know, if somebody is getting ipilimumab, I basically tell them to, you know, have a low threshold for starting steroids versus somebody is receiving axitinib plus pembrolizumab, for example.
I think that's great advice, and you know, and Raina said this as well. You know, I'd rather be safe than sorry.